And I believe we are live on Facebook. Welcome, Sister Ingrid. So we have Brother Joni Carley with us. Will you please introduce us? Or please, Sister?
Yes, you guys are all in for guys and gals and everyone who is tuning into this frequency, all beings that are called to attune to this message. We are broadcasting live from World Unity Week 2026, a new beginning. And with us is Reverend Joni Carley, and she's going to bring us through this session of consciousness and metaphysics, our most powerful domains at work. Reverend Joni Dr. Joni Carley, author of The Alchemy of Power, Mastering the Invisible Factors of Leadership, works on consciousness and culture through advisory consulting services, serving as a United Nations ECOSOC representative, talks, media guest expertise, and articles geared toward a principles-based, values-driven, peaceful world. She co-founded the United Nations NGO Major Group Unitive Cluster and serves on the advisory board for the Sadhguru Center for a Conscious Planet at Harvard Medical School and also on her local Transition Town Board. Joni holds a Doctor of Ministry in the Reinvention of Work, is a former applied ethics professor and an ordained international minister with over 30 years of experience in co-creating spiritual events with indigenous, religious, and spiritual leaders and spirited artists, including at the 40th annual UN Interfaith Ceremony, where she was awarded for her interfaith leadership at the United Nations, the UN World Interfaith Harmony Week celebration, UN Forum on Indigenous Ceremony, and for Global Unity.Earth celebrations. Welcome, Dr. Joni. We're so glad you're here. Thank you.
I'm so thrilled to be here. It's really an honor. Hi, everybody. I want to speak for a while and then have some dialogue and then speak a little more and finish up with dialogue. So I want to talk about consciousness because everything we make happen in the physical world happens first in our consciousness. And that makes consciousness a really important place to work from. And yet we usually overlook it, or it's something we can only talk about when the real stuff is handled. And so I wanted to offer this session today because I think it's time to make consciousness explicit, because how we manage our consciousness has everything to do with how we transition into a new world, into a new paradigm. We can no longer afford to be unconscious of our consciousness, because even though we experience consciousness as an inner domain of reality, it's determinant of every outer reality we encounter. So then what is it? Well, Lord Krishna said, quote, "Water cannot wet it, wind cannot dry it, weapons cannot shatter it, fire cannot burn it. It's ancient, it's unborn, it's not subject to death," end of quote. Consciousness is where we know the peacefulness of a situation we're in, and it's the domain where we sense our own inner contentment. Without our consciousness, we would have no imagination, no creativity, no insight, intuition, or even choice. We can't see it, but without consciousness, there's no seeing. Our consciousness is reflected in our language, and yet language can never fully express it. Consciousness is a subtle body of information that lies far beyond our mind and our thought processes. In fact, it appears to be mostly non-local. It's more accurate to say that we are in the field of consciousness than it is to say that it exists inside of us. So while it feels like it's an internal experience, our consciousness connects us with the rest of the universe. It's also where we connect with that primal pulse of God that animates everything in our universe and beyond. Consciousness also has a generative power. It determines what our experiences are, and it also determines how we're impacted by our experiences. So you could say it's both the alpha and the omega. Consciousness is the primal generator, as well as the ultimate interpreter of our reality. Anything that becomes physical first lives as potential in the domain of our consciousness, because that's where we conjure up our physical experiences. So matter is derived from consciousness. Consciousness always comes first. In that sense, you could say that consciousness is an engine of causality. As goes our consciousness, so goes our world. Our consciousness literally determines how we live and how we survive. Consciousness is a catalyst for everything, everywhere. The bottom line is consciousness is a fundamental determinant of the human experience. It's a primordial power that determines how we respond to, how we participate in, and how we impact the world around us. It's the portal through which we know our spirituality, and it drives our ever-evolving potential. So then where is it? Well, it's in the metaphysical field. And metaphysics is the science and the philosophy of causality and being. So in other words, it's the study of what causes what. The field of metaphysics explores the intangible underlying drivers of our lives. And metaphysical things are kind of like the underside of an iceberg. 95% or more of the iceberg is below the surface of the water. And even though you can't see it from a boat, that area determines not only the iceberg's future, but also the future of the boat. And physicists tell us that the physical manifestations of our reality only constitute about 1 to 5% of it. And that means that the metaphysical is at least 95% of our story, just like the underside of the iceberg is 95 to 99% of its existence. And similar to the unseen iceberg bottom, metaphysical elements are not visible, and yet they're determinant of every physical phenomenon's past, present, and future. And just like the part of the iceberg below the surface determines what occurs on and around the iceberg, addressing metaphysics enables us to account for the causative factors in our reality, things like vision, things like purpose and love. And it's where we examine the intangible drivers of our decision-making, like will, and the human spirit's impulse to expand. So I'm mostly here to say that metaphysics matter a lot, probably more than any other factors we can name. The quality of what we manifest depends on how well we manage the metaphysics, and that depends on the condition of our consciousness. And that's because the domain of consciousness is where we experience our innate connection to the metaphysical factors that play out as our lives. And as much as I'm trying to explain that, I'm very conscious that this is all a mystery. The more we understand about these things, the more mystery we encounter, the more the mystery opens up. And consciousness is our place of interconnectivity with the mysterious, with that holy spark of the human spirit that is unique in each of us and yet common to all of us. And the best way to access the power of metaphysics is to just attune to our consciousness, attune to how that's tapped into love and peace. And also to focus on the frequency of spirit, God, the ultimate creator, no matter what name you give to the source, bringing your consciousness there as a way to open it up. Because when we turn our consciousness toward that great intelligence, it magnifies that universal light that flows in, around, and through each of us. The physicists are telling us now what the sages through the ages have always said, and that's that we are each a fractal of the whole. And just like all fractals are both discrete parts of the whole, and at the same time also hold all of the whole, our consciousness is uniquely ours, and yet it holds all of Source. In that sense, our consciousness is seated with divine light, and tapping into that light is a metaphysical key to unleashing our innate power to create a new world that's happy and well. And we all have to start with ourselves. I like to ask, how's my mojo? And how's everybody else's mojo? And, there's other words for that, but that energy, that spirit, that human spirit that's unnameable and untouchable, that some call it Shakti, the indigenous tribes that I stayed with, the Amazon, called it Orutum. And so it's important to ask for ourselves, but it's really critical that we don't stop there. If we're going to move ourselves from the meta-crisis and go through the metamorphosis we need for a new world, it's a matter of consciously harnessing that inner light and that mojo for greater good. And I think that's really critical to not only develop for yourself, but to then expand that lens as what does that mean for the world and how do I contribute there? So how do we work with these things? In terms of causation, consciousness is root causal. It's a metaphysical driver of how our lives manifest. And that's why we have to recognize it as a legitimate, explicit domain of work. We say the word and we kind of assume we all know what it is, but we don't stop and really work it. And that's what I'm advocating for today. Because if everything that occurs in the physical plane occurs first in the metaphysical plane of consciousness, then every single social crisis we have in this world is the result of a crisis of consciousness. And I think one of the biggest underlying problems of these times is that our cultural norms tend to dismiss the metaphysical as inconsequential, fluffy stuff. In my book, The Alchemy of Power, I call it the fluffy myth. Here's my book. The prevailing, and the fluffy myth is the prevailing belief that intangibles are irrelevant and they're inconsequential, fluffy stuff. But nothing could be further from the truth. Even so, for millennia, we've all been acculturated by our social norms. I mean, I wrote a book about it, and I still am very much acculturated by these norms. And they lead us to believe that metaphysical things like truth and beauty and goodness aren't as valuable as physical things like money and projects and products. And we not only overlook it and dismiss it like that, but we've used derogatory terms like woo-woo and airy-fairy to denigrate metaphysical concerns. And that prejudice toward the metaphysics creates social and economic norms that place very high value on things that most of us don't care very much about, like stock prices. And these norms also hold very little valuation at the same time for the intangible things that we actually value the most, like joy and connection to each other. And so because that kind of blindness and prejudice is part of the old paradigm, I want to bring in some new perspective. And there's an ancient concept of yin and yang that come from Taoism that I think provide a really helpful lens because they depict the metaphysical energetics. Unity is our underlying state, but by virtue of having bodies, we're necessarily dualistic. We've got a front and a back, we've got an inside and an outside, we've got males and females, we've got a physical heart and amorphous souls. So our very existence entails polarities, like we've got positive and negative, dark and light, good and bad. And yin and yang are helpful in exploring how that polarity is true, and at the same time also consistent with our unity. That's because when you see the yin-yang symbol, both parts are expressed equally in the same circle. And they're always a little bit of the yin, the circle of the yin and the yang part of the circle, and the circle of the yang and the yin part of the circle. They're not absolute. And at the same time, they're highly differentiated, and yet you look at that circle and they're infinitely one. And so they make a really good lens for us. And one of the things that makes yin and yang also helpful is that they're not absolute fixed points. They're always relative. They represent energetic flow. So they're not about, here's the permanent north, here's the permanent south, one is yin, one is yang. That's not what yin and yang are, and that's why they're helpful. So we could do an entire session on this, but I just want to give a little overview because I do think it's helpful. And you could, there are some systems that totally reverse and say yin is what I'm going to tell you yang is, and yang is what I'm going to tell you yin is. And it really doesn't matter because we're just describing polarities. So yin is expansive, yang is contractive. Yin is intangible, yang is tangible. Yin is more feminine, yang is more masculine. Yin is more complex, yang is more basic. Values are more yin, rules are more yang. The territory of our wholeness is yin, and the expression of our individuation is more yang. Yin is like the negatively charged electrical current in the wall, and yang is like the positively charged current. And both are best in equanimity with each other because that's when the sparks fly. And we exist in an ever-emergent web of life that weaves from simplicity to complexity and back again, from wave to particle and back again, from chaos to structure and back again, from yin to yang and back again. And we are the co-weavers, and our consciousness determines how our web manifests. And I think one of the big problems is that our current norms are yang dominant, and they have been for millennia. And that's how we got so acculturated with these norms. And for example, we've had male religious and political leaders for millennia, mostly. Militarism has predominated our approach to governing ourselves in the West for millennia. Young dominance is reflected on how much money goes toward weapons and junk, and how much relatively little is dedicated to caring and goodness. And in my book, I call this problem yangitis. And yangitis is the disease of highly inflamed yang. We have been so yang dominant for so long and with such dire consequences that there's an emergent global impulse to swing yinward. I say, when in doubt, yin out. And including, we've got renewed interest in sacred feminine, in women's leadership, equal rights, those kinds of things. We're seeing a cultural swing toward higher valuation for yin things like wisdom and nature. And we have to be really, really careful not to constrain this yinward swing in gender-based language. Gender is a very narrow slice of our wholeness. And especially now with gender being more fluid than it has been at any point in our history, saying that this is a swing toward the feminine is true, but it's highly limited expression of the paradigm shift that we're in. And that's where I think yin and yang is really helpful. And I did a session on this with a physicist, Will Keepin, for the United Nations Commission on the Status of Women, on using yin and yang as a lens on social development and to transcend gender bifurcation. And afterwards, I'll put a link to that in the chat. I think it was really helpful to get the scientific perspective on that. So while our collective yangitis requires us to swing yinward, the work is not to create yin dominance. It's to find a dynamic equanimity. And I'm using that word and not the word balance, because balance is a stagnant state, and equanimity reflects the ever-changing nature of reality that Taoism points toward. If you breathe in, you're more yang, and when you breathe out, you're more yin. So if you found balance, you'd have to die to keep it. So, that's really, we're in a state of movement, and we're always and at many levels, it's an infinitely leveled thing. You could be a little yin and a little yang and a lot of each at the same time. And I think the samurai warriors of Japan were really good examples of this idea of equanimity. They studied 64 arts, and that included flower arranging, music, tea ceremony, and the martial arts. They were developed not merely as an army of fighters, but they were developed as adepts. They developed their adeptness with the full spectrum of yin and yang, so that they would have the freedom to choose in any situation whether they should lean more yinward or lean more yangward. And I submit to you that that's freedom. Not that I have to be more yin now, I have to be more yang. It's to be able to flow in the moment as is right. They considered the martial arts to be the lowest ones, and they were trained to resort to those last. And we can borrow from that warrior mindset as we navigate these transformational times, because we're kind of teetering between social and economic systems that just aren't fit for the purpose of our survival. And there are emerging systems that aren't fully rooted yet. So our work at this moment is to find greater equanimity between the yin of our heart's desires and the yang of healthy productivity. And this is a really critical moment in time. It also requires that we be really intentional with our language. Being diligent with how we use language as a means to develop and tap into the power of our consciousness. And that starts with truth-telling. Being impeccable with your word will develop your consciousness, and vice versa. The more developed your consciousness, the more impeccable your word is. Also, paying attention to values is one of the easiest ways to tap into consciousness. And at the same time, focusing on values is a good way to usher in new ways for the world to operate. Values like dignity, equality, and respect, they express in the physical world, but they originally occur in our values, in our consciousness. So these values are kind of like the bridge between the physical and the metaphysical. and they serve as navigational tools between the natural yin and yang polarities in our lives. Values provide our why. Studies show that values are the primary drivers of our behavior. Values are even more primary drivers than genetics, according to twin studies. For example, a lot of us value family, and so we're driven to spend time with them. And so that's the kind of thing, we don't even think of it, but at the underlying causative, operative, energetic is the value of family. So values like compassion and justice and kindness, they drive us to become better people because they grant us access to that metaphysical place where vision occurs, and then they help us clarify how we can act on that vision. You could say that values are like the gears of evolution, and consciousness is like the invisible field that those gears operate in. You could also look at values like the building blocks of change in consciousness. You could also look at values as being the building blocks of change, and as consciousness determining what we build. How we manage our values and how we develop our consciousness has everything to do with whether and how we'll transition from the current meta crisis into a flourishing world. Focusing on values helps us tie the rocks to the clouds. We have these grand visions, and we got to have the rocks too. We've got to anchor it into reality. And values help us translate the best of what arises in our consciousness into the best we can do on the planet. And so I have some more to say, but I want to pause here for some questions and thoughts before I go on. So if you can use the chat or raise your hand.
Anyone has a question, please raise your hand. We do have the mics locked right now, so or either wave in the camera and Ingrid will find you. There's Joan. Let's get your camera on, sister. There you are.
Wow, Joni. So beautiful, so beautiful.
Thank you.
Oh, dear. This value thing is really, drives the way we think. And the thinking is actually the way drives how we act. So if we wanted to look at how we act, then we have to go back to value, which led to that metaphysics. So now, after, because we were talking about the value for a long time, and then later on, feel like I didn't really connect with people. And last week, we were at this politics realm and at this science technology space. And all the people were talking about how can we come together, work together, coordinate things together. Seems we are seems who is in charge? No one is in charge. And there we are in this vicious cycle that they were determined. There was regulation and enterprise and vendors. So all this looking at each other, but no one is in charge. But yet there's something is going on. So that's part of the people are looking for something, but yet consciousness is not open to the mainstream yet.
Yes, thank you. I think, and I want to go, I'm going to move forward into unitive consciousness, and I want to hear from Ingrid first. Thank you, Joan.
I was just thinking that it actually, the question is in the answer is in the question feel of the charge thing. So, but I'm curious as to where you're going to go next with this, and let's keep going.
Thanks. So I want to talk about unitive consciousness. science is demonstrating that our wholeness is not only within our own skin, it's showing that we are whole with the entirety of all that is, from pre-particle to atoms to people to planet and beyond. And that holistic worldview is coherent with most religious and indigenous wisdom. The science is part of an emergent unit of consciousness that recognizes that we are existentially unified in all of our glorious diversity. Unit of consciousness is knowing that unity is not a far out utopian aspiration. We just are interconnected with all else. And we're all interconnected with all that lies beyond what we can even imagine. I like to think of it as that we're all indigenous to Gaia, meaning that we're all indigenous to the whole of creation. And we're all indigenous with that primal pulse of the Great Spirit that pulses through each of us, no matter what our bloodlines or ancestors carried or what we believe or who we vote for. Scientists are revealing our wholeness at all scales of existence and through many different fields of study. And the evidence is very clear that we are interdependently co-arising with everyone and everything else. And that requires us to completely reorient our ideas about how to govern ourselves. The evidence demands that we move beyond characterizing unity as a pipe dream, because we know that unity is our existential reality. Our unity is just what's so. Unfortunately, our norms don't reflect that truth. Current policies and practices are mostly grounded in the false premises of separation consciousness. That we hold unity to be some unrealistic dream. And there are these kind of underlying assumptions that we're naturally divided against ourselves. And so we have to live in fear and violence and competition to survive. And that's a function of young itis, of that young dominance. And it has us functioning from a really deep fundamental separation consciousness. And I want to use a few examples here, mostly from my work at the UN. There's a motto at the UN saying, "No one left behind." And in the predominant separation-based worldview, that's a noble enough vision. Don't leave anybody behind. It sounds righteous. But in most indigenous communities, there's no such thing as behind. Their worldview is much more holistic, and their social structures tend to be more circular than linear, and they're far more egalitarian. So getting people out of the behind position isn't even a thing for most tribal people, because their worldview doesn't accommodate their even being a behind to begin with. So my response to the "no one left behind" motto is, who are we that there's such a thing as behind? As long as our mindsets and our systems are anchored in the myth of separation, there's always going to be a behind. And so somebody's always going to be in it. And that's what this paradigm shift we're living through is about. It's not just cleaning up the area of behind, it's eliminating it. And it's replacing it with a radical inclusion. And that's where unit of consciousness comes in. Because unit of consciousness recognizes the inherent dignity of every thread in the fabric of life. It's where we know that we are all in this together. Unit of consciousness says that we each matter and we all matter. I wouldn't be me if you weren't you. Ubuntu. When we center our consciousness in the reality of our unity, it provides a more true and therefore a more stable metaphysical basis for causing the world we all want to live in. Consciousness of our unity is a game changer. And it is that because it resituates the field away from needing to pray or work for unity based on the erroneous assumption that we're not already unified at the very core of our existence. Unit of consciousness moves us away from talking about fixing these fragmented silos of needs and wants, and it reestablishes us in a holistic context. And that context more accurately reflects the reality of our interdependence and our interbeing. We're living between an old way that's falling apart and a new way that's yet to be shaped. And this transformational moment in history calls on us to consciously create new patterns of awareness, and patterns that recognize our unity as familiar separation patterns are crumbling. Recognizing our innate unit of consciousness supports us in transcending these old patterns of thoughts and feelings. Because that myth of separation is what grounds those patterns, and that's just simply a faulty base of operations, so it can't hold, and it's not holding. So these times require us to start shifting our vision away from addressing the symptoms of our crumbling separation-based worldview. It's not time to push against anymore, because the energy of pushing against really just makes whatever you're pushing against the definition of the field when you've got the whole universe to work in, and it puts all the energy on that thing you're pushing away rather than into the possibility. So it's so important. The shift is so subtle and so important and so profound. Consciousness is a phenomenal energy that can become anything. So it's a determining factor in both how we get through these transitional times and especially in where we land in our evolutionary trajectory. The emergence of unit of consciousness is helping to redefine what constitutes good governance and social development. And I want to talk about a few examples of that. So about 3 years ago, a group of us, and Tez is on this call, I see, my dear partner in this work, we started an NGO major group unitive cluster at the United Nations, and that's a UN mechanism for working on the UN agenda. And these were a group of 16 non-governmental organizations who were certified representatives at the UN, and who were just frankly sick and tired of tiptoeing around these words like spirituality, vision, and love because all the prejudice that I talked about earlier. We had just had enough of using code words to talk about things like consciousness and transformation. So with the help of the Evolutionary Leaders Sustainable Development Goals Thought Leadership Circle, we decided to form the Unitive Cluster as a way to name and claim spirituality and unit of consciousness as critical factors in global governance and economics. And what we work on is the UN agenda, and I'm going to hold up a graphic of this is the UN agenda. It's 17 blocks of color, and it's basically a to-do list for the world. And it's things like no poverty, no hunger, good health, gender equality, clean water, kind of pretty much anything you'd imagine the world needs done now, they put into 17. And there are a lot of goals and targets that really anchor these. And they're pretty good. I mean, the whole world agreed on them, which was already something, and they have limitations, so they're not an end-all be-all. But what I say is the unitive cluster works in the white space between all these blocks of color, because that's a way of framing the metaphysical space where factors like mindset, spiritual vision, and ethics play out. And that space exists not only between the blocks of color, but over, behind, and through and around all of them. Because these things like vision and values are all pervasive and they're amorphous, they don't occur in neat little boxes. So we've had some good track record of making UN interventions. It's been tricky at times because so much the prevailing mythology of separation is the basis, and so we have to resituate the ground and then speak into it. And we are certainly getting traction on that because the world's ready. The world is turning. And another piece of evidence to that end is that global systems are swinging inward is the Doha Declaration of 2025. And that the Doha Declaration is a major global development platform. And what it does is it reaffirms the global commitment to, and I'm going to quote here, a political, economic, ethical, and spiritual vision for a social development. Doha's explicitness on spiritual vision reflects that emerging shift in global consciousness. This is a really big deal. While political vision may manifest as goals and targets, the lens of a spiritual vision raises up metaphysical factors. And just having those two words in such a major declaration opens the door in a really huge way, because now things can get based on that, and we start to build from this language. It seems kind of inconsequential, all tucked in one document, but it allows people to have this conversation. It puts this conversation into the global calculus. And that raises up the possibility of peace and well-being for all of us. It makes us all safer. So I just want to close with saying that creating the world we all want to live in requires that we treat our values as beacons of light that can guide us to a world that works for all life. And it requires that we recognize the domain of consciousness and the field of metaphysics as critical areas of work. So I so appreciate this opportunity to explore these things with you today, because I know that when we come together in the fields of metaphysics and consciousness, the spirit of our vision is anchored on solid ground. Thank you. And now we'll open the floor for some thoughts and questions. And I see Annie.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Joni. Great to hear you and be inspired, reminded of all of this. And so that is my question, is what do you suggest in terms of opening ourselves to that? Actually, tomorrow I'm going to be talking about the inner child. And I think as children, we're born with that sense of unity consciousness, right? And so with my experience as Montessorian for 4 decades with young children, and I'm not here to plug that, I'm just saying that that's, the path that I've kind of looked at. And so I would love to hear what you suggest to us.
As far as inner child, as far as
as far as accessing that our that field of consciousness. I mean, of course I can think of, meditation, yoga, but I just would love to hear your suggestions.
I think just coming to honor that it matters. That, we're so trained to kick this stuff off and to, even if it matters to us and we're meditators and it's a big part of our lives, still in our general day-to-day conversation, the water we swim in is a water of separation consciousness. It just is, until we make the shift. And the more we swim in it, the more we catch these distinctions as they come up. And I think in a lot of ways, it's like learning a language. I know that when I've learned different languages, often when I put my head on the pillow that night, then I remember that word I should have said. And then as I get the language a little better, I remember that word an hour later. And then, I'll fish for it in the moment the next time, and then I'll have it in the moment the next time. Mm. And so it's partly just really falling into that discipline of coming back to, it, and feeling the discomfort of it, and really maybe even just sitting with it, not even needing to articulate it, but saying, this is a separation-based feeling, and I may not have the words, I may not have the ways to step out of it right now, because I am swimming in this big field right now. I just need to swim so I don't drown. And we don't need to save the moment every moment of the day, because that can be pretty obnoxious to the people around us. But to just have the discipline to come back. And I think also this unit of consciousness, I think one of the traps in the work we've all been doing for so long, and I tried to touch on this a little bit, was we come into the importance of self-development. And I think that is critical and basic. And at the same time, a lot of what we espouse stops there. And then we get sort of a narcissistic wheel spinning. So I'm better, and now I'm better, and I'm better, and now I'm better, and now I'm better, and I'm better, and I'm better. And that's just not enough to get us to where we need to go, because we are one. And so we need to kind of expand our own boundaries. And being better just for yourself is not in the spirit of Ubuntu, right? It's to come back into that Ubuntu consciousness. I'm better because you're better. And you wrote that thing that inspired me, right? And I don't even like the word better, because that implies that there's a worse. We just are where we were, and we're going where we're going. And we have a lot of facility in where we're going. And it's a question of deploying that facility, of being conscious of it. And where the self-development work comes is we get some, like the warrior, their self-development is where they get the capacity to use some of these things. But it's in the applications and taking it out in the world. It's, that's really what we need right now, is to step out of this loop of it's a little bit like going to the opera in some of these circles. It's a me, right? And so, we got to expand into a greater song.
Get out there and practice. All right.
Yeah,
Good.
and open the lens,
Mhm.
open the lens that it's not a personal rainstorm.
Wonderful. Thank you.
I see Cynthia. Go
Oh,
ahead.
yes, I had to push several buttons. Thank you, Joni, for your wonderful talk, and I'll put a plug in for your book, The Alchemy of Power,
Thank you.
because I've read it and it's really very insightful. Probably need to read it several more times to get it all. But you know what you're talking about, bringing the spiritual in to our work and just every part of our lives. Um, in a very visible way, I've found is important. I'm working on my second documentary about Gandhi's wife, Kasturba Gandhi, and I very consciously allow time with the moving of the plot, which, needs a lot of time because she was so active in her life, but to put in her spiritual basis, which really was what empowered her throughout her life. That was the most important thing to her. So, but I'm putting it in there and hoping everyone will take notice. But what I wanted to just mention, I love, your discussion about the indigenous wisdom about the circular and not the hierarchical. And Gandhi, of course, his wisdom, he said, was as old as the hills, and by that he meant it was indigenous. But his vision was of oceanic circles. And so it was that idea of circles with no hierarchy, no one top, bottom, no one behind and forward, but just all in equal mutuality and interdependent circles. But you have a responsibility as your own governance, to maintain the appropriate ethics required and all of that. And he had this idea of sarvodaya, which is the rising of all or the uplift of all. And so it wasn't exactly, what you were saying about no one behind. It was the idea of everybody rising together, really. And that is the vision. And as you said, sages and poets have said this for eons. Rumi says you are not a drop in the ocean, you're the ocean in a drop. So anyway, but I love this, and I really appreciate too finally what you were saying about the Tao, because I think it has so much wisdom for us today to tap into, and just the whole aspect of that. So I would love to hear you give a talk entirely on the Tao sometime.
I would
Because,
love to do that because I think yin and yang is such an important, helpful right now because it isn't so absolute and separate. That's always like I'm a little more yang than other women, but I'm more yin than a bulky guy. So it's also relative, and I think that's really helpful. Um,
yes, thank
and
you.
yeah, and to that end, here are the links for my book and also for that session with Will Keepin. And Will is brilliant on this. He and I were co-authors of the Holo Movement book, and when we were at the authors party, we started to chat about yin and yang. And I said, Will, I think we're really on to something. Why don't we table it and go back to the party and then develop this later? And we developed it pretty far along, and then we just let it go. And then when the unit of cluster was figuring out what it wanted to do for its contribution to the Commission on the Status of Women in 2024, we invited Will in with me to unpack this from our different perspectives. And I think he is so brilliant. And I think his unpacking and the way we dance it together, I think is really helpful in this space. And I want to say also thank you for bringing in spirituality in your film because that's why we started the cluster. Is that it's kind of this kind of considered the secret part, the part where you have to be careful or you won't get your mainstream audience. You have to
Right.
not lose your credibility. I mean, if you said when I first started at the UM, we were doing leadership dialogues with self-selected leaders from within the system. They were mostly departmental heads. And they were saying that if they said some of the things that they were saying in our sessions in the wrong elevator, they could lose their career track.
Wow.
And I think most of us who have been on this path for a long time have had similar dynamics in our lives. You didn't say it around in certain crowds. You didn't, you used code for how you approach these kinds of things in different places. And all bets are off now. It's time to make these things explicit. And that's why I wanted so much to do this session today is just make it explicit that consciousness is real. Metaphysics are real and they matter. And these things are, these things that get you to consciousness, that expand your consciousness, even if you don't have, and most of us don't, because words aren't enough in this domain. And the more we find, the closer we get to it, the more it expands and the less we know. And that's just the nature of the territory. And that's really what Taoism said, is if you can name it, it's not it. And so
Yeah,
we're in that space, but it is time to move beyond the prejudices to it and to not kowtow to those prejudices. And at the same time, to be mindful of speaking into the listening. That's what Werner Erhard used to say, speak into the listening. So if you're speaking to a group where this is not going to land, Jesus said, do not put your pearls before swine. And he was talking about the teachings, and he wasn't saying everybody who doesn't like these teachings is a pig. He was saying that, the nature of swine isn't going to roll stuff around in the mud. That's just the nature of what swine do. No, they're not wrong. It's just what they do. And so if you have precious pearls of wisdom, then put them where they're going to be appreciated as pearls of wisdom. So it's, and that's more and more places. So I can just tell you my experience around the UN, I think about 16, 18 years now. I mean, certainly you had to be very careful in the beginning, and it's just not true anymore. And what I do now is I kind of wait until the conversation, if I'm not presenting, then I really have an agenda around this. But the conversation, I wait until people get in the ballpark of this. And people do more and more often, they do it without me initiating it. So they'll start to talk about values. They'll start to, spiritual vision is something now that anybody can talk about because it's in the Doha Declaration. And we're writing these kinds of phrases into other declarations. That's part of what the cluster does. And more people are writing these things in. And so once it kind of comes up in the room, then I push the envelope and I push it a little further into this conversation, a little more radically into the conversation. And I'm sure there's still people who walk out of the room and think I'm crazy. But what I find is more often people are relieved because they know that we can't get there from this old way of thinking. And most of the people in the room, this is what's on their desks. They have to solve these problems. This is what their work is, what their job is, and they know that they're ill-equipped. And they don't know it's because, paradigmatic always, but some do. And a lot of people say that this is kind of what I've always been thinking, or I've been starting to think, but I didn't have the words, or I had the words, I was afraid to say it here. Some people represent, when I first started at the UN, I represented United Religions Initiative, and that represents every religion pretty much in the world as a member of that. Well, I had to be very careful because I was representing much more than my own viewpoint. And then I moved to represent Cosmos Journal, which has a huge viewpoint that is all of this. And so I had carte blanche to do that. And now I represent Pathways to Peace, which also is a very progressive organization, an enlightened organization that recognizes this territory is critical if we're going to have peace. And so that also gives me leeway that colleagues don't often have. And so I can say things that they can't always say. And so sometimes that's the feedback I get afterwards was, I'm glad you said it. This is what I believe, but I just couldn't represent that in this case. But more often than not, people are appreciative and people are liking that there's new language for them to use and that some of these things are being articulated, because that is part of the shift into this new paradigm. And that's part of why watching our language is so critical. Because our language is a product of that old paradigm. This goes back millennia. Our language has developed over millennia. So our epistemology, ontology, our very basis of understanding is encapsulated in this old consciousness. And so it's really just being mindful. Same thing as learning that language. It's like, well, if if I use this word, oh, I could have made that distinction, and I just didn't realize it till I went to bed, but the next time I can make it in the moment, or I was too worried that people would push back or people would think I'm crazy, or and guess what? People don't think you're crazy anymore. I mean, those of us who've been doing this for a long time, we still carry a little bit of that burden on our shoulders because we've paid dearly for that, many of us have paid dearly on our professional paths and our social paths for holding these places. And now that price really isn't so high as it used to be. And in some ways, there's high reward where there didn't used to be reward for bringing it here. So the courage to speak it, the courage to be in that truth of these things mattering, even if you can't quite find the words, just open the space of the dialogue is really, really meaningful because it's vibration. It's all vibration. And so when you put language out, sound is especially vibration. It's especially powerful vibration. And so just watching your own language around this kind of consciousness is really meaningful. Telling your own truth and your deeper and deeper and deeper truth.
Thank you.
Any other thoughts?
Wonderful, Reverend Joni. So does anyone have any final comments or questions for our
I'm
beloved
not
sister here?
sure
We
if
are
you know that
moving into
Hezekiah
our
came in with Pathways to Peace. Hezekiah.
can we just
Sorry.
wait till I'm hang on a second because I've got white noise. Let me turn my air off because I was speaking and so anyway, does anyone, I see Reverend Joni, somebody said something, I had my air conditioner on, I couldn't hear.
I just want to make a comment to comedians. Yes, stand-up comedy is one of my very favorite things in the world. And because comedians, in the past, the jester was often the only one who could tell the king the truth. And good comedians, I mean, there's a lot of raunchy junk out there, but good comedians really are truth tellers. They really do say courageous things. Richard Pryor, George Carlin, I mean, they really broke open a lot of what happened through the 60s and the beginning of transformation.
That's wonderful. I totally missed how comedy got into it. But like I said, let's blame the white noise from the air conditioner. I believe Sister Joan has her hand up. Come on in, sis. Welcome. Let's get you unmuted.
Joan, just to let you know, we're coming to the top of the hour.
Yes, I understand that right now because you are talking about the world is ready, which we see that the world is ready, and we are taking this message to the mainstream right now, and just to see how, because it's very delicate, just as you were saying, you watch first and then expand that. And I thought you were doing marvelously, and which is why I feel very difficult to express that, articulate in the way that how you have done. So I was wondering if it's possible that you could share some sort of, is that notes is in part of
I'm
the
sure there are
book,
Zoom notes
or?
from this, and there will be a recording. And you brought up something, Joan, that I would love to touch on. And that's we often have this conversation of we're speaking to the choir and how do we get it out there to those other people. And that's a real symptom of our old paradigm separation-based mentality because it sets up an us-them. It sets up that there's somebody different than us. And I would suggest to you that this choir is naturally growing and has been for a long time. And even people who may not see themselves as members of it are resonating in ways that they didn't. I mean, those are the examples. And Doha was a perfect example of that. And that's happening all throughout. And so I would say make a joyful noise and don't go into this consciousness of proselytizing to those others, because that just really perpetuates that separation-based consciousness. They are us, we are them, Ubuntu.
Yes,
Yeah, I think that's so
understand
important,
that,
because
but
we are
when
not the choir. The whole world is, just sing and open the doors for more joyful noise to come to join us and to listen.
beautiful, beautiful. Thank you.
Thank you, sister. We are 3 minutes out. And I want to jump back in here and said I caught up with the chat and I now know where the comedy came from. Thank you, Marina. It all makes sense. I'm going, wait, what did I miss? Okay, wonderful. Reverend Joni, such a blessing to always be around your presence. Any final comments? Any final closing thoughts?
I just want to thank you all for being here. It's been such an honor, and I look forward to continuing this conversation.
And with that, family, we are going to take our stream down.